Tonight, Stephen Leacock.
He was more famous than this country.
He turned a hard life into humor.
He was the jester, and he had more sadness in him than most people would ever begin to believe.
Unmasking Canada's best-loved storyteller. I'm Anne-Marie MacDonald. Before there was Canadian literature, there was Stephen Leacock. Like his contemporary Mark Twain, he put his corner of the world on the international map with humor and wisdom that was homegrown, but not homespun. Yet the man who wrote the sunny satire had to overcome his share of darkness. The beloved bard of Orillia was most famous for his sunshine sketches of a little town. But you'll be surprised to learn what Leacock's real bestseller was. And as for beloved, well, the relationship was a little more interesting than that.
Who hasn't seen Lake Simcoe has never seen a lake at all. Lake Simcoe on a July morning, the water ruffled in wavelets of a blue and green and silver, as clear as never was. The sky of the purest blue, with great clouds, white and woolly, floating in it. Just the day for fishing. Every day is for the enthusiast.
Stephen Leacock played many roles in his life. The carefree sportsman was one of his favorites. To readers everywhere, he projected an amusing benevolence. Indeed, his humor made most of the world feel good about Canada. But behind the smiles was a complex, driven man, burdened in ways that were deeply hidden.
He was a man of many faces and many masks. He was the jester. He could be the life of the party. He could be the jovial, genial, gregarious character and laugh hard and laugh at his own jokes. And he had many sad sides to him, and probably more sadness in him than most people would ever begin to believe.
He was more famous than this country. 1912, for example, a lot of people in Europe who'd never heard of Canada knew about Stephen Leacock. Now that is fame indeed.
I think that without Leacock to Paul Hebert, to W.O. Mitchell, to Max Ferguson, to Dave Broadfoot, to the Air Farce, to the Second City, to This Hour is 22 Minutes, I think is an unbroken line. An evolution of satirical, clever, essentially benevolent humor. Even when it's being wicked, it's being benevolently wicked.
The limpid waters of Lake Oh What a Wetness abound with every known variety of fish. These fish rise instantaneously to the bait and swim gratefully ashore, holding it in their mouths. In the middle depth of the waters of the lake, the sardine, the lobster, the kippered herring, the anchovy, and other tinned varieties of fish disport themselves with evident gratification.
I was born at Swanmore, Hants, England on December 30th, 1869. I am not aware that there was any particular conjunction of the planets at the time, but should think it extremely likely. My parents migrated to Canada in 1876, and I decided to go with them. My father took up a farm near Lake Simcoe in Ontario. This was during the hard times of Canadian farming, and my father was just able, by great diligence, to pay the hired men and, in years of plenty, to raise enough grain to have seed for the next year's crop without buying any.
The tough farm life in Egypt, just south of Lake Simcoe, was particularly shocking to Stephen's parents. In England, they had grown up wealthy. On their own in Canada, their heads were barely above water.
They were poor enough. I remember my mother telling me that at Christmas, Gran made a great effort, but all she could scare up for the bottom of her Christmas stocking, she said she'd left us each a pencil and an orange.
I went into Hoodoo's room quite early Christmas morning. I woke him up, and he sat up in bed, his eyes glistening with radiant expectation, and he began hauling things out of his stocking. The first parcel was bulky. It was done up quite loosely and had an odd look generally. Aha! Hoodoo cried gleefully as he began undoing it. I bet it's the puppy dog all wrapped up in paper. And was it the puppy dog? No, no, by no means. It was a pair of nice, strong No. 4 boots, laces and all, labeled Hoodoo from Santa Claus. The boy's jaw fell with delight. It's boots, he said.
He was a good student. He was serious. He certainly played a lot with his brothers, had a good time on the farm, I suppose. At the same time, I think life on the farm was very difficult for him. And when he talks about what happened on the farm back in those days, it's a bittersweet experience.
At intervals, my father drank, drove away to the village in the evening to return late at night after we were in bed, or lay round the farm, too tired to work, and we thought it was the sun. And the more he drank, the more the farm slid sideways and downhill, and the more the cloud of debt of unpaid bills shadowed it over. And the deeper the shadow fell, the more he drank. My mother hid it all from us for years with a devotion that never faltered. My father, as he drank more, changed towards us from a superman and hero to a tyrant, from easy and kind to fits of brutality.
His father's self-destruction led Stephen to a confrontation that changed his life. As the oldest male still at home, he had to act. If you ever come back, he threatened his father, I will kill you. W.P. Leacock was never seen by his wife and children again. 17-year-old Stephen Leacock became the head of the family.
I think the whole business of that family was really very sad in a way, because the older brothers would be peeling off to have gone perhaps out on their own. Well, they were never once the whole 11 together. Of course, also family to him was all centered on Gran and his brothers and sisters, and they were funny family in a way. They quarreled and so forth among themselves, but they were all deeply attached to each other. So I think his feeling very much was try to keep the family together, and he was trying to do that until he finally had to give in, and they had to mortgage the farm and break up what was left of the family.
Despite the family's poor prospects, a good education was considered essential for Stephen. The money was found to send him to Toronto's Upper Canada College. Cost for room and board, $45 a year.
At Upper Canada College, he was the top pupil there. I mean, he excelled at practically everything. And he was well-liked as well. I mean, he was co-editor of the College Times for 3 years. He graduates as the top person in the class. He takes a year at U of T, but it's also a crisis time.
With his mother and siblings to support, the extraordinary future that seemed to lie ahead of him would have to wait. He left his studies and went to work teaching school.
I spent my entire time in the acquisition of languages, living, dead, and half dead, and knew nothing of the outside world. Very soon after graduation, I had forgotten the languages and found myself intellectually bankrupt. In other words, I was what is called a distinguished graduate, and as such I took to school teaching as the only trade I could find that needed neither experience nor intellect.
Those 10 years that he taught school, high school, they were difficult years for him, but he did during that period, at least, he started to write comic stories for magazines, and those go very, very well, and then he gets disgusted basically with school teaching and doesn't write as much perhaps as he should. But in the end, he says to himself, look, I can keep up with the school teaching and just die intellectually, starve myself, or else I can do something greater. And that's when he decides to go to Chicago in 1899. And he develops a whole new interest in political economy.
At the turn of the century, both Canada and the United States were growing at a dizzying rate. Immigrants poured in, cities built out and up. The Chicago Leacock encountered contained a vast urban underclass and a small, unimaginably wealthy elite. The contradiction fed his writing for years to come. He fell in love with Beatrice Hamilton, an aspiring actress and cousin to Sir Henry Pellet, the man who had built Canada's biggest mansion, Casaloma. They married in 1900.
Oh, Aunt Beatrice, Trix we called her. Or Aunt Trix. She was tall, very beautiful, long hair heaped up, and very serene and quiet. And she had a lovely deep voice, and she was lovely to all of us.
Shortly after his marriage, Leacock was hired by Montreal's McGill University, based on his success at Chicago, where he earned a PhD in economics, magna cum laude. His earliest success was not humor, but instead a pioneering textbook on the new discipline of political science. It became a standard and was in fact the biggest single moneymaker of his career.
It was published in, I think, 1906, and it was translated into 17 languages. It went through constant reprintings.
By 1907, Leacock is a star in the making. Finally, in the right environment, he had learned to love teaching, and McGill students took to him. He was a full professor with substantial textbook royalties and a good income from his popular platform speeches. He could now afford to build a country home and to create there the secure environment he had never known as a child. He wrote to his mother.
I am awfully anxious to buy a small place on Lake Couchiching next spring. I shall try to have enough money for the land and will live on it in tents and shacks for next summer and build on a large scale the year after. I want to have at least 10 acres, a sort of small farm, room for a very large garden, an orchard, a wooded lot and a field of root crop, hen feed and so on. It will become a charming English place. I'm tired of cities and people. It's a case of goodbye, proud world, I'm going home.
Leacock's humor was home-brewed. The family was full of witty people, and it encouraged him to sharpen his observations and his timing. His early pieces built on the eccentricities of people he knew. These were rewritten to become his first book, published in 1910. It made Leacock a celebrity, and from then on he wrote ceaselessly, articles, books, and lectures. He efficiently recycled material. Anything with his name on it sold well.
Vast forests of primeval pine slope to the very shores of the lake, to which descend great droves of bears, brown, green, and bear-colored. While as the shades of evening fall, the air is loud with the lowing of moose, caribou, antelope, cantaloupe, musk oxes, musk rats, and other mammalia of the forest.
Dear Mr. Leacock, I have had a year's enjoyment out of 2 of your books, Literary Lapses.
My dear sir, permit me to thank you for the joy I've experienced in reading your nonsense novels, which a friend gave me as a Christmas present.
Stephen Leacock, Esquire.
I am taking advantage of the preface of one of your books to thank you for the pleasure your books have given me.
We know that the most important thing for him was royalties. If the royalty check hadn't arrived on a Saturday, he sent a letter on Monday saying, where is it? He was very conscious of his need for material possessions. And that may be because of his upbringing, when he had something, but he didn't have a lot. And he really wanted to store a lot, to store a lot of money, to store a lot of things for his own good and for the good of his family.
Stephen and Trix shared a charmed and busy life in both Orillia and Montreal. They were well off and well known, good hosts and popular guests. But for 15 years, they were childless. Finally, in 1915, an unexpected miracle.
My dear mother, young Stephen was born at 2:45 this afternoon. He is a fine big boy, in fact a real corker, and weighs 8 1/4 pounds. Beatrix had made an error about the date of his birth, but thank heaven we left Orillia in time, or the journey might have been too much for her. I never yet saw a baby that looked so complete, so all there, so little like a red monkey as Stephen does. Indeed, he seems to me a most remarkable child. Be sure to let me know right away how soon you can come, and come as soon as you can. Your loving son, Stephen Leacock.
Aunt Trix and Uncle Stephen have been married for quite a few years. I can't remember how many. I thought it was around 15, but maybe it was less, maybe it was more, before their only child was born. And so the whole family, there was a sort of air of rejoicing. I can even remember this at home, you know, when he was born. And we recognized that this was the crown prince in the family. Stevie was there when I first remember coming over here. He was just a very small, yes, he was in rompers, so he must have been only, say, 3 years old or something like that. And I remember particularly he had a beautiful rocking horse, which was much too big for him, but that a very big, expensive rocking horse, which I'm sure his father must have bought. Anyway, he was wearing glasses even when he was a very small child. And his father protected him in a way really from living his own life, because for one thing, at a certain point it was discovered that Stevie wasn't growing. And this terrible apprehension, while they were coming to terms with that permeated the whole family. Everybody was worrying about it, and you know, the apprehension of what is this going to mean.
My dear Goldbloom, when I bring Stevie, don't let him hear any of our talk as to whether he has grown or not. He has become sensitive and also gets afraid of all medical discussion at times. Naturally, he has a hell of a lot of it. I think he's growing, but I hate to measure him. I am giving him winter sport and exercise.
In 1925, Stephen Leacock was at the height of his powers and fame, earning more than $40,000 a year. He had overcome his childhood trauma by tightly controlling every aspect of his life. But he was powerless when that year, Beatrix was diagnosed with inoperable breast cancer.
He loved her deeply, very, very, very deeply. When she came down with cancer, he spared no expense whatsoever to find all the latest cures. Some of them were quackeries, and he rushed around the world obtaining cures or taking her for treatments, because something had to stop her from dying, and nothing could stop that.
In desperation, Leacock took Beatrix across the Atlantic to Liverpool to undergo the most advanced radium bombardment, but she did not respond. 2 weeks later, his beloved Trix died, leaving a 51-year-old husband and a 10-year-old son.
The real adoring husband overtalks his wife, overdominates her, pays with unexpected presents for easy forgiveness of his ill temper, and never knows that he adored her till it is too late, because now she cannot hear it.
Stephen Leacock was at his most eloquent when writing about southern Ontario. He loved the land, knew the waters, and understood its people. He built a summer home on Old Brewery Bay, close to Orillia, and spent summers and Christmas there.
And I think he really found his own peace and tranquility here. And this is where his creativity did flourish, where he could think freely and expand his mind by doing the little things in life that give everyone pleasure.
Leacock loved the Brewery Bay life, a little writing discipline mixed with a lot of fun. The guests came in droves from Montreal and Orillia. Leacock directed every aspect of the business he had created. He kept meticulous records of everything he wrote and all works in progress. Order and regularity ruled Leacock's life. He kept a farmer's schedule, rising by 5:30 to write in his boathouse in the early morning light. Hours later at the breakfast table, guests were entertained by brand new work. And now the real day began, fishing, sailing, or work in the garden.
Do I do all the gardening myself? Oh, yes. There isn't any fun in it if you don't do it yourself. Did I dig it? No, I didn't dig it. That's pretty darn heavy work. Every spring I get a man to dig it, and then I get a boy for the weeding, and I get a woman in to do the picking. But beyond that, I do the whole thing myself, especially the planning.
Well, I tell you one thing that was awfully odd, and it quite outraged Orillia, was that, you remember, he fancied himself as a farmer, and which is very funny because when he so hated the farm at Egypt, but he fancied himself as a farmer, so he was taking baskets of peas and tomatoes in to sell in Orillia in the stores. Well, now that, by their lights, they knew he was a rich professor from Montreal, and this rich man is selling his veggies, you know, like that is very odd.
Well, he called himself a farmer. He thought of his property as his farm, and indeed it did have, you know, a good many working acres, livestock, orchards, garden crops, and took great pride in that title, as a matter of fact.
He'd put on his summer farm clothes, which in those days really still consisted of a white shirt and a tie and big baggy pants. And he might go barefoot, and he might put his shoes on, or just whatever he felt like. And he had all the pleasures here. He could go fishing at the point. He could go swimming in the morning with his dressing gown on and have breakfast out in his boathouse. And he could talk to the local fellows, and they'd come to visit. And he had his gardener, Bill Jones, and they had their greenhouse out here, and they would work away at getting plant seeds. And of course he had his chickens, and he had his farmhouse, and he took great pride in trying to look after the farm animals, and I don't think he did it awfully well, but he had a lot of fun.
Stevie Jr. became Leacock's deepest concern. In the summer, especially without his mother around, diversions had to be created.
I think probably I was probably about 7 years old, and Dr. Leacock wanted friends for Stevie. And so a group of us whose parents he had met, he were invited to come, and they were wonderful days because we could swim and we could roam around and we could do essentially whatever we felt like doing. We had a very fine time. And of course we put on plays, and that kept us going all summer.
Leacock's summer writings always included short plays to be performed by neighborhood children. The real agenda was scarcely hidden. Stevie Jr. was often the star.
I think this was his way of creating entertainment for Stevie Jr. And often Stevie Jr. would be cast in the plays, and all the neighborhood children, and they'd all be part of the cast and crew, as well as a lot of the adults, and they loved it. They'd spend the whole summer designing the costumes and write formal invitations and RSVP. Dinner would be served ahead of time, and then the evening would commence.
The curtain was just about here, and all our parents sat on chairs down here, and this was the stage. And how in the world, there must have been a curtain, because people pushed us through the curtain onto the stage. We had a great time putting on those plays.
Every fall started the annual cycle again. The summer home closed up, and Leacock took the long drive back home to Montreal to his other life, to face a new crop of McGill economic students eager to hear the entertaining and famous Dr. Leacock.
His real world was McGill, and from when he started to teach there to when he retired, that was the center of his existence. McGill was an alive, vital world that he made his own place in. He had a coterie of close friends, and that's where he really created his own life.
Leacock's Montreal was Canada's economic powerhouse at the turn of the century. There was tremendous wealth, and Leacock often rubbed shoulders with it. But he had an intense aversion to Montreal's moneyed elite.
He didn't mind that people were wealthy, but he disliked their fatuousness, the wealthy who weren't aware of what they had or didn't want to do anything with it.
Leacock took this to satiric heights by writing about life for the wealthy in Montreal.
The Mausoleum Club stands on the quietest corner of the best residential street in the city. It's a Grecian building of white stone. About it are great elm trees with birds, the most expensive kind of birds, all singing in the branches. The street in the softer hours of the morning has an almost reverential calm. Great motors move drowsily along it, with solitary chauffeurs returning at 10:30, after conveying the earlier of the millionaires to their downtown offices. The sunlight flickers through the elm trees, illuminating expensive nursemaids wheeling valuable children in little perambulators. Incalculable infants wave $50 ivory rattles in an inarticulate greet to one another. $1 million of preferred stock laughs merrily in recognition of a majority of control, going past a go-kart drawn by an imported nurse. And through it all, the sunlight falls through the elm trees, and the birds sing, and the motors hum, so that the whole world, as seen from the boulevard of Plutoria Avenue, is the very pleasantest place imaginable.
He was a gifted teacher, but academia was passing Leacock by. His reputation for humor had spoiled his chances to be taken seriously. Over time, his work in economics and public policy was forgotten.
Perhaps the mix of lightheartedness and attention to detail was such that it just didn't capture the political imagination. People increasingly came to Leacock expecting to find humor, and but along with the humor, there was a serious message.
Leacock was capable of transcending his innate conservatism and his times. In 1920, he wrote a pioneering critique of Canada's social welfare system and a plea for children's rights. The ideas still sound fresh.
It should be recognized in the coming order of society that every child of the nation has the right to be clothed and fed and trained irrespective of its parents' lot. Our feeble beginnings in the direction of housing, sanitation, child welfare, and education should be expanded at whatever cost into something truly national and all-embracing.
What Leacock was in effect saying is that this should be a right that is guaranteed to every man, woman, and child. And some have seen this as an early call for a well-developed argument, and it, I would say in the Canadian context at that time, it was quite unique.
In many other ways, Leacock was an ordinary man of his times, far from progressive, enjoying his privilege as a successful white British male.
We idealize him and we regard him as a heroic figure, but at the same time, I think we should be careful. He was an exponent of the British Empire. He did espouse the view that for Canada, people who should live here should be of British stock. People from the Orient, from India, from China, and Poland, Russia, they weren't the best people that we wanted to have in Canada. And on the women's question, he opposed giving women the franchise, the vote. He placed women on a pedestal. He had a very old-fashioned view of women. He didn't regard them perhaps as intellectual equals. We have to understand that he was a product of his time. He accepted many of the ideals of the 19th century. It's disappointing, but that's simply Leacock, and we have to accept that.
There it lies in the sunlight, sloping up from the little lake that spreads out at the foot of the hillside on which the town is built. There's a wharf beside the lake, and lying alongside of it, a steamer that's tied to the wharf with tow ropes. The steamer goes nowhere in particular, for the lake is landlocked, and there's no navigation for the Mariposa Belle except to run trips on the 1st of July and the Queen's birthday, and to take excursions of the Knights of Pythias and the Sons of Temperance to and from the local auction townships.
They're up by the steps there. I think they want to do some photographs.
In Sunshine Sketches, his most famous and beloved book, Leacock created the mythic town of Mariposa, where the sun shines perennially and the folks are happy in a subdued southern Ontario way. But the people in his Mariposa resembled well-known real people in Orillia. He hadn't asked their permission, and often they didn't like it.
And there are still a few people in town today, certain families whose ancestors were depicted in Sunshine Sketches, who still like to say that they will never forgive him. We have the old story that there were the families who were mentioned in Sunshine Sketches who will never forgive Leacock for having poked fun at their ancestors. And then there are the families who weren't in Sunshine Sketches, and they're equally upset because he didn't poke fun at them.
Orillia's suspicion of Leacock had a lot to do with the Leacock lifestyle.
They had a love-hate relationship with each other. Leacock loved Orillia, and they loved him, but sometimes I don't think they liked him very much. They weren't used to this kind of activity and high living going on, and they couldn't understand it. What were they doing out there?
Leacock was now an industry, churning out a steady stream of books and articles. Yet it was the Depression, and his income had dropped. Uncertain of the costs of Stevie Jr.'s continuing medical problems, he felt pressured to find new sources of income. After turning down a number of earlier requests, he finally agreed to try his hand at radio.
I understand you agree to 26 broadcasts, 2 per week, Mondays and Fridays starting March 26th, stop. Other arrangements, as in my letter February 15th, stop.
Now, I don't mean to say that I've acted in any of the great metropolitan centers. No, I haven't. Not even in my own hometown of Montreal. I haven't appeared on the stage, but I have appeared close by, out at Verdun, out there where the provincial asylum is. They said they wanted me to stay right there. They were just delighted. They saw no reason why I should go away.
Leacock was wrong for radio. He sounded smug and conceited. He laughed at his own jokes and was fired after 18 broadcasts. It was his first notable failure, but he got a good story out of it.
What is radio? I shall be only too glad if someone will tell me, simply and in words I can understand, what radio is. Let him understand at the outset that it is no use telling me that by means of radio I would be able, seated comfortably in my own armchair, to hear the Pittsburgh Orchestra. I don't want to. Nor do I wish for information involving the use of such words as receiving circuit, rheostat, and variometer. I've already read a little book called Radio for the Beginner, and it has beaten me. I've sent away for another that is called Radio for Infants, but I have very little hope for it.
As time went on, the Leacock lifestyle fed Aurelia's gossip mill. Leacock liked a beer at lunch and a scotch after dinner. He relished the name of his summer home.
If they like the name Old Brewery Bay, they're all right. They can have anything on the place. I have known that name, the Old Brewery Bay, to make people feel thirsty by correspondence as far away as Nevada.
He led a wonderful lifestyle of socializing, and of course in Montreal, you know, they had fine dining and dinner, and they all had cocktails before dinner, and they drank good wine with dinner, and if he went fishing, he would take his flask and go fishing, and he certainly, in the breweries, the local brewery truck from Barrie would roll in with a summer stock, and he'd stock up his wine cellar. This was all very unusual, and in a dry community, which Aurelia was until the late 70s, very dry. It was unheard of.
Oh, well, yes, it was scandalous. It was quite scandalous. I think and that certainly lasted. I don't think no matter what anybody does, it's still the prevailing notion of Uncle Stephen would be of an old drunkard. I mean, if they're, you know, except from the Montreal perspective, that's what it would be. Wild parties, drunken, womanizing, odd people coming. You know, there was definitely odd goings on here.
From the 1930s, the dry 30s, the Prohibition 30s, when parties went on here constantly, and the rich and famous were entertained, while the populace suffered in general. And many people never really get over that. Their whole opinion of Leacock was based on those kind of impressions of someone who really ignored the law, flouted the law, and drank just as much as he wanted.
Now, long before this area became famous, the Aurelia area that is, because of Gordon Lightfoot or the closeness to Casino-Rama,
there's another gentleman who brought a lot of fame to this particular area. His name was Stephen Butler Leacock.
Now, you can visit the Leacock home if you'd like. It's now a museum. Take a guided tour through there for a nominal fee and see just what Leacock's family lived like, look at some of the original manuscripts and so on.
There was a real lack of understanding of the international and national impact that Leacock had. I don't think they really knew that this gentleman that came in every summer, who was a little bit eccentric in their estimation, a little bit different, and they didn't really understand that this fellow brought the world to their door. So they put up their guard a little bit. And I think that guard has continued even into today.
The locals, they sort of understood who he was writing about. They're a little more literate than he realized. And because of that, although his initials might have been SBL,
he was known more around here at the time as an SOB.
Dr. Stephen Leacock. Pursuant to the above resolution, the governors have instructed me to notify you that you will be retired from the university on May 31st, 1936.
His love for McGill is unprecedented, and he, even after he was sort of let go, because he retired when he was 65, but he couldn't believe he would be retired. Everyone else could retire, but he thought he'd stay on because he was an exception to every rule. He really thought he would stay on. Things were very hard for him, and he doesn't have any outlet. He doesn't have anywhere else to go.
He regarded what happened to himself at McGill as a shameful episode in his life, and thereafter, retirement for him was not something that he looked forward to. The onset of old age, declining health, the loss of friends, and ultimately death.
Old age is the front line of life moving into no man's land. No man's land is covered with mist. Beyond it is eternity. As we have moved forward, the tumult that now lies behind us has died down. The sounds grow less and less. It is almost silence. There is an increasing feeling of isolation, of being alone. We seem so far apart. Here and there one falls silently and lies, a little bundle on the ground that the rolling mist is burying. Can we not keep nearer? It is hard to see one another. Can you hear me? Call to me. I am alone. This must be near the end. I have been asked how old age feels, how it feels to have passed 70, and I answer in metaphor as above, not so good.
His own childhood trauma and the death of Beatrix led Stephen Leacock to an almost obsessive concern for Stevie Jr.'s medical condition. His son's lack of growth hormone kept him strangely young-looking, and it was said that Leacock treated his son as the age he looked, not the age he was. Stevie never got over it.
But like the sons of many famous people, finding a role that's satisfying and fulfilling is very, very difficult, if not impossible, particularly if you bear the same name and have somewhat the same mind. And this is as it proved. Stevie was quite creative. He could write well. He had a penchant for teaching, but teaching jobs were very short and unsuccessful. He didn't need to work. There was plenty of money there for whatever he wanted. And after his father died, I think he had a very confused personality.
In 1944, Stevie Jr. was finally left on his own when Stephen Leacock died. He was 74. For a man who wrote so much, Leacock left behind almost no traces of who he really was. His stories revealed little. Throughout his career, he had hid behind his many benevolent public faces, and at the end, only a few close friends and family knew what had driven him to become, for almost 3 decades, the voice of Canada.
When you're working here every day and you live your life on Albury Bay for 9 years like I have, you do become very intimate with the sense of who he was and the sense of place here, and the feeling of the spiritual feeling of his persona that still is here. And there are tourists that, when you read the guest book, you do get a sense of that. They come here and they feel a peace and tranquility, and they feel creativity start to flow, and they feel his presence.
There's a kind of deep echo of Canadian writing in the whole place, but it's all belongs to Leacock. Sometimes on a summer evening along the hedge road, I sort of think I see him, walking through the twilight with his Panama hat and his unkempt look. Just walking through the twilight, he's still there.